In the annals of military history, few stories capture the raw courage and impossible odds that define true heroism, like the tale of Lieutenant Commander Sarah Phoenix Mitchell. What started as a routine reconnaissance mission over hostile territory would become one of the most daring prison breaks in naval aviation history, a story of survival, sacrifice, and the unbreakable will of a woman who refused to leave her fellow servicemen behind. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The year was 1991, and the Persian Gulf War was reaching its crescendo. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Mitchell, call sign Phoenix, was already a legend among her peers. At 28, she had logged over 2,000 flight hours and was only one of 12 female pilots cleared for combat missions in the Navy's elite Strike Fighter Squadron. Her FA-14 Hornet bore the scars of 7 successful combat sorties, and her reputation for bringing everyone home had earned her both respect and the unofficial title of Guardian Angel among the younger pilots. Sarah's path to the cockpit hadn't been easy. Born in rural Montana to a family of ranchers, she had always felt the pull of the sky. Her father, a Vietnam veteran who had lost his left leg to shrapnel, initially opposed her military ambitions. "The military breaks people, Sarah," he had warned her during countless arguments around their kitchen table. But Sarah possessed something that couldn't be taught or discouraged, an unshakable belief that she could make a difference, and the skill to back it up. She had graduated top of her class from the Naval Academy, where she endured harassment, discrimination, and the constant pressure to prove she belonged in a man's world. Her instructors were split between those who wanted to see her fail and those who pushed her harder than any male cadet, knowing she would need to be twice as good to get half the recognition. Sarah thrived under both types of pressure, earning her wings and quickly establishing herself as one of the most technically proficient pilots in her squadron. On March 15, 1991, Sarah received her orders for what seemed like a routine mission. Intelligence reports indicated that a large enemy supply depot was operating approximately 60 miles behind enemy lines, near the Iraqi border. Her mission was simple: conduct photographic reconnaissance of the facility and return with detailed intelligence for a potential bombing run. It was the kind of mission she had flown dozens of times before. Get in, get the intel, get out. As she performed her pre-flight checks that morning, Sarah couldn't shake an unusual feeling of unease. Her crew chief, Petty Officer Martinez, noticed her unusually thorough inspection of the aircraft. "Everything okay, Commander?" he asked, his weathered hands adjusting a panel on the Hornet's wing. "Just being careful, Martinez," Sarah replied, running her hand along the aircraft's fuselage. "Something feels different about this one." It was a feeling she had learned to trust during her years of flying, that subtle sixth sense that separated good pilots from dead ones. The weather was perfect that morning, with clear skies and minimal wind. Sarah's FA-18 Hornet lifted off the carrier deck at 0630 hours, climbing rapidly into the dawn sky. As the Gulf waters fell away beneath her, she couldn't have imagined that she was about to embark on a mission that would test every skill she had ever learned and push her beyond the limits of human endurance. The flight to the target area was uneventful. Sarah maintained radio silence as briefed, flying at 25,000 feet to avoid most surface-to-air threats. Her radar warning receiver remained quiet, and the electronic warfare suite showed no signs of enemy activity. For 45 minutes, it seemed like just another routine mission. As she approached the designated coordinates, Sarah began her descent to a lower altitude for the photo run. The intelligence briefings had indicated minimal air defenses in the area, an assessment that would prove to be catastrophically wrong. At 8,000 feet, she began her approach to the target, her camera systems automatically beginning to capture the detailed imagery that would guide tomorrow's bombing mission. The supply depot below was larger than expected. Through her heads-up display, she could see dozens of vehicles, fuel tanks, and what appeared to be temporary barrack structures. But something else caught her attention, something that made her blood run cold. In a fenced compound adjacent to the main facility, she could see rows of small structures that looked suspiciously like prisoner holding areas. Her training kicked in, and she began to document everything, knowing that this intelligence could be crucial. It was then that her radar warning receiver exploded to life. Multiple surface-to-air missile sites had just gone active, painting her aircraft with their targeting radars. Her training took over instantly. She banked hard to the right, dropping chaff and flares while diving toward the deck. The first missile streaked past her canopy close enough that she could see the exhaust trail. Sarah's hands moved with practiced precision across the controls as she fought for her life in the sky above enemy territory. The second missile was already in the air, and this one had a better lock on her aircraft. She rolled inverted and pulled hard, the G-forces pressing her deep into her ejection seat as she tried to break the missile's guidance system. The Hornet responded beautifully, but Sarah knew she was fighting against mathematics and physics. Surface-to-air missiles were designed to kill aircraft exactly like hers, and she was deep in their engagement envelope with nowhere to run. She deployed more countermeasures, precious chaff and flares that she might need later, while pushing her aircraft to its structural limits. The third missile found its mark. The explosion sent a shockwave through the aircraft that Sarah felt in her bones. The master caution panel lit up like a Christmas tree as multiple systems failed simultaneously. Her left engine wound down with a grinding noise that every pilot dreads, and she could smell smoke beginning to fill the cockpit. Worse yet, her flight controls were becoming increasingly sluggish, indicating damage to the hydraulic systems that made the aircraft controllable. "Mayday, mayday, mayday," Sarah transmitted on the emergency frequency, knowing that her position was well beyond the range of friendly forces. "Phoenix 17 is hit and going down. Grid reference follows." She rattled off her coordinates, though she suspected no one could hear her transmission. The aircraft was losing altitude rapidly now, and Sarah faced the most critical decision of her career. She could attempt to nurse the damaged Hornet back toward friendly territory, likely crashing in the desert miles short of safety, or she could eject now while she still had altitude and control. Both options were grim. Ejecting over enemy territory meant almost certain capture, but staying with the aircraft meant almost certain death. As if the decision were being made for her, the second engine began to show signs of failure. Oil pressure was dropping, and the exhaust gas temperature was climbing into the red zone. She had perhaps 2 minutes before complete power loss. She made her choice. "Phoenix 17 going down," she transmitted one final time. Tell them I tried to bring her home." The ejection sequence was violent and disorienting. One moment Sarah was fighting to control a dying aircraft, and the next she was tumbling through the air at 200 miles per hour, her ejection seat's rocket motor having fired her clear of the Hornet just seconds before both engines failed completely. Her parachute deployed automatically, and suddenly the world became eerily quiet, except for the sound of wind through the parachute's lines. Below her, Sarah's FA-18 impacted the desert floor in a ball of flame and twisted metal. She had just lost not only her aircraft, but also her ticket home. Now she was alone, behind enemy lines, with nothing but her survival training and the limited equipment in her survival vest. As she drifted down toward the desert floor, Sarah could see vehicles already converging on her aircraft's crash site. The smoke plume from the wreckage was visible for miles, and it wouldn't be long before they started looking for her. She had perhaps 10 minutes before she would be fighting for her freedom on the ground. Sarah landed hard in a rocky wadi, about 2 miles from the crash site. The impact drove the air from her lungs and sent a spike of pain through her left ankle, but she forced herself to move immediately. Step 1 was to gather her parachute and hide it. The white silk would be visible from aircraft for miles if left in the open. Step 2 was to take inventory of her survival equipment and plan her next move. Her survival vest contained the basics: a pistol with 2 magazines, a survival radio, water purification tablets, a first aid kit, signaling devices, and enough food for perhaps 3 days, if she was careful. It wasn't much to sustain a person in hostile territory, but it was what every pilot carried, and it would have to be enough. As Sarah buried her parachute under a pile of rocks, she could hear the sound of vehicles in the distance. They were already starting their search pattern, and it wouldn't be long before they found her landing zone. She had to move, and move fast. But as she prepared to begin her evasion, Sarah remembered the images she had captured during her photo run, the compound that looked like a prisoner of war facility. Somewhere out there, possibly only a few miles away, were Allied servicemen who had been shot down or captured during the conflict. The thought of leaving them behind was almost unbearable.
Every instinct told her to head south toward friendly territory, to use her survival training to evade capture and make it back to coalition lines. But another voice, the same one that had driven her to become a pilot against all odds, whispered a different message. Those men were counting on people like her. They were counting on someone who wouldn't give up, someone who would find a way to bring them home. Sarah Mitchell made a decision that would define not only the rest of her life, but the lives of 200 American and Allied prisoners of war. Instead of running toward safety, she turned north, toward the enemy compound, and toward what would become the most audacious rescue mission in modern military history.
The desert night was Sarah's ally as she made her way toward the enemy compound. She had spent the entire day hiding in a deep ravine, watching enemy patrols search for her, while she studied their patterns and timing. The heat had been brutal, over 110 degrees Fahrenheit, but she had conserved her water and waited for darkness to provide cover for movement. Through her binoculars, Sarah had been able to confirm her worst fears about the compound. It was, indeed, a prisoner of war facility, and it was much larger than the intelligence reports had indicated. She counted at least 8 separate barracks buildings within the razor wire perimeter, along with guard towers, administrative buildings, and what appeared to be an interrogation facility. Worse yet, she could see prisoners being moved between buildings, men in flight suits and desert camouflage who were clearly Allied servicemen. As night fell, Sarah began her approach to the compound. She moved carefully, using every piece of cover the desert landscape provided. Her Naval Academy training in land navigation served her well as she dead-reckoned her way through the darkness, avoiding the main roads where enemy patrols were most likely to travel. The compound was situated near what appeared to be a small military airfield, a detail that hadn't been visible in the intelligence photos, but which Sarah could now see clearly. Several aircraft were parked on the tarmac, including what looked like transport planes and helicopters. An idea began to form in her mind. Crazy and desperate, but perhaps their only chance. Sarah spent 30 minutes conducting reconnaissance of the facility's perimeter. The guards were numerous, but followed predictable patterns, changing shifts every 4 hours, with a brief period of confusion during each transition. The fence was electrified, but she located 2 points where maintenance gaps provided potential entry routes. Most importantly, she identified the location that seemed to house the largest concentration of prisoners, a long, low building near the center of the compound that she estimated could hold 50 or more men. But Sarah's most crucial discovery came when she observed the aircraft on the nearby airfield. One of the transports was a Soviet-made An-12, a 4-engine aircraft capable of carrying substantial cargo or personnel. Through her night vision equipment, she could see fuel trucks servicing the aircraft, indicating that it was being prepared for a mission. More importantly, she could see that the aircraft's cargo bay was large enough to hold a significant number of people. The plan that formed in Sarah's mind was audacious beyond reason. She would infiltrate the prison compound, locate and organize the prisoners, then somehow commandeer the transport aircraft and fly everyone out. The obstacles were enormous. She would need to overcome the guards, break into a heavily secured facility, convince potentially traumatized prisoners to follow her orders, steal an enemy aircraft she had never flown before, and then navigate back to friendly territory while avoiding enemy interceptors. Any rational person would have dismissed the plan as suicide. Sarah spent 30 minutes trying to think of alternatives, but every other option led to the same conclusion. The prisoners would remain in captivity, potentially for years. Many might not survive that long. She had seen what happened to POWs in this region, and the thought of abandoning 200 American servicemen was unacceptable. Her attack began at 0200 hours during the guard shift change. Sarah had positioned herself near the maintenance gap in the perimeter fence, waiting for the brief moment when the guard towers would be undermanned. When the opportunity came, she moved with the speed and precision that had made her one of the Navy's top pilots. The first challenge was the fence itself.
The maintenance gap was barely large enough for a person to squeeze through, and the electric current had not been shut off, despite the opening. Sarah used her survival knife to short out the electrical system at that point, creating a brief shower of sparks before the section went dead. She slipped through the gap and immediately sought cover behind a fuel storage building. From her concealed position, Sarah could observe the guard patterns more closely. The facility was protected by approximately 30 guards, most of them stationed in the towers or patrolling the perimeter. Only a few guards were assigned to the interior, suggesting that the captors were more concerned about external threats than prisoner uprising. Sarah's first target was the communications building, a small structure near the main gate that housed the facility's radio equipment. If she could disable their communications, it would prevent them from calling for reinforcements or air support when her escape attempt began. The building was guarded by a single sentry who walked a predictable pattern around the structure. Moving with the stealth that her survival training had taught her, she approached the guard from his blind spot. Her hand-to-hand combat training from the Naval Academy proved sufficient to neutralize the sentry without raising an alarm. She secured his weapon, an AK-47 with 4 magazines, and quickly entered the communications building. The radio equipment was more sophisticated than she had expected, suggesting that this facility was more important than a simple POW camp. She used her basic knowledge of electronics to disable the primary radio transmitters, then cut the telephone lines for good measure. The facility was now isolated from the outside world, buying her precious time for the escape attempt. Her next objective was the prisoner barracks, but as Sarah moved toward the building, she made a discovery that changed everything. Through a window in what she had thought was an administrative building, she could see maps, documents, and what appeared to be intelligence materials. This wasn't just a prisoner of war camp, but an interrogation center where captured Allied personnel were being questioned about military operations and capabilities.
The intelligence building revelation made Sarah's mission even more urgent. These weren't just prisoners. They were being systematically interrogated for information that could compromise ongoing Allied operations and cost countless lives. She could see through the window that several prisoners were being held in small cells within the building, likely the ones who possessed the most sensitive information. Sarah quickly modified her plan. She would need to neutralize the interrogators first, then work her way through the compound to free all the prisoners. But as she studied the building's layout, she realized she wasn't alone in her surveillance. From the shadows near another building, she could make out the figure of someone else watching the guards. Moving carefully, Sarah worked her way around the perimeter until she could get a better look at the other figure. To her amazement, it was a man in a tattered flight suit, clearly an Allied pilot who had somehow escaped from the main prisoner barracks. He was armed with what appeared to be a guard's rifle and seemed to be planning his own assault on the facility. Sarah made a command decision. She couldn't coordinate with the unknown pilot without risking exposure, but she could time her attack to coincide with whatever he was planning. She positioned herself near the interrogation building and waited for his move. The escaped pilot struck first, attacking a guard tower on the opposite side of the compound. The diversion was exactly what Sarah needed. While the guards rushed toward the sound of gunfire, she entered the interrogation building through a rear window. Inside, Sarah found a scene that filled her with rage. 3 Allied officers were chained in small cells, showing clear signs of torture and abuse. One was unconscious, another was barely coherent, and the third, a Marine colonel named Davidson, was alert enough to recognize her uniform despite her disheveled appearance. "Navy?" he whispered hoarsely. "How many of you are there?" "Just me," Sarah replied as she worked on the locks with tools from her survival kit, "but we're getting everyone out of here tonight." Colonel Davidson's eyes widened. "Everyone? There are over 200 prisoners in this camp." "I know." Sarah said grimly, "I've seen the transport aircraft on the airfield. We're going to use it to fly everyone home." The colonel stared at her as if she had lost her mind, but he didn't argue. Years of military training had taught him to recognize competence and determination, and despite the impossible odds, something about this young Navy pilot convinced him that she might actually pull it off. Sarah freed the 3 officers and quickly assessed their condition. The unconscious man had a severe concussion and would need to be carried,
The second officer had 2 broken ribs but could walk. Colonel Davidson was in the best shape, despite obvious signs of interrogation, and his rank would be crucial for organizing the other prisoners. "Colonel, I need you to help me coordinate this escape," Sarah said as she handed him one of the AK-47s she had acquired. "We have maybe 20 minutes before they realize what's happening and call in reinforcements." "What's the plan?" Davidson asked, checking his weapon with professional efficiency. "We're going to create as much chaos as possible while systematically freeing every prisoner in this camp. Then we're going to steal that transport plane and fly everyone back to friendly territory." Davidson nodded slowly. "You know that aircraft is probably Soviet-made, right? Different from anything you've flown before?" Sarah smiled grimly. "Colonel, I've got over 2,000 flight hours in everything from trainers to fighters. How different can it be?" Their conversation was interrupted by an explosion from the other side of the compound. The escaped pilot was still fighting his own battle, and Sarah realized they needed to link up with him to coordinate their efforts. The 3 freed officers were in no condition to fight, so Sarah made the difficult decision to leave them hidden in the interrogation building while she continued her assault on the main prisoner barracks. The scene outside had descended into chaos. Guards were running between buildings, shouting orders in Arabic, and trying to organize a response to the attacks. Sarah used the confusion to her advantage, moving from building to building while staying in the shadows. She reached the main prisoner barracks just as a group of guards was attempting to establish a defensive perimeter around the building. Sarah had learned during her reconnaissance that this building held the largest concentration of prisoners, nearly 150 men, according to her estimates. But it was also the most heavily guarded. From her position behind a fuel tank, she could see that the building had only 2 entrances, both of which were now covered by guards with automatic weapons. Any frontal assault would be suicide, but she couldn't think of another way to reach the prisoners inside. That's when she remembered the fuel tank she was hiding behind. The plan that formed in Sarah's mind was even more reckless than stealing the aircraft. She would use the fuel tank to create a massive explosion that would serve as both a diversion and a way to breach the prisoner barracks. The risks were enormous. The explosion could kill prisoners as well as guards, and she would have to time everything perfectly to avoid being caught in the blast herself. But desperate times called for desperate measures, and Sarah had already committed herself to bringing these men home no matter what the cost.
Sarah's demolition plan required split-second timing and nerves of steel. She used her survival knife to puncture the fuel tank, allowing diesel fuel to begin pooling on the ground around the building. The strong smell would eventually alert the guards, giving her perhaps 5 minutes to complete her preparations. Working quickly, Sarah created a fuse using strips of cloth from her flight suit soaked in diesel fuel. She positioned the improvised explosive device to direct most of the blast away from the prisoner barracks while still creating enough force to breach the wall and distract the guards. The physics were imperfect, but it was the best she could do with limited resources and time. As she prepared to ignite the fuse, Sarah heard a voice behind her. "That's either the bravest or stupidest thing I've ever seen." Sarah spun around to find the escaped pilot she had seen earlier. Up close, she could see that he was an Air Force major with the call sign Reaper stenciled on his flight suit. He was armed with 2 AK-47s and had clearly been through his own battles during the night. "Major Jake Morrison," he said, extending his hand, "and you're either the cavalry or you're as crazy as I am." "Lieutenant Commander Sarah Mitchell, Navy. And I'm definitely crazy. Are you in or out?" Morrison grinned despite their desperate situation. "I've been planning this breakout for 3 weeks. I'm definitely in. What's your plan for getting everyone out of here?" Sarah quickly outlined her strategy to steal the transport aircraft. Morrison's expression grew increasingly amazed as she detailed her reconnaissance of the airfield and her assessment of the AN-12's capabilities. "You realize that aircraft probably has a crew of 4 and requires specific startup procedures?" Morrison asked. "I'm counting on finding at least 1 transport pilot among the prisoners. And if not, I'll figure it out. How hard can it be?" Morrison stared at her for a moment, then shook his head with admiration. "You Navy pilots are all insane. I love it." Together, they refined the assault plan. Morrison would create a diversion at the main gate, while Sarah's explosive breached the prisoner barracks. Once the prisoners were free, Morrison would help organize them while Sarah secured the airfield and prepared the aircraft for takeoff. One more thing, Morrison said. There are at least 6 guards inside the barracks building with the prisoners. They have orders to execute all POWs if there's any escape attempt. Sarah felt her blood run cold. She had been so focused on the external guards that she hadn't considered the possibility of guards inside with the prisoners. Any explosive breach could trigger the execution she was trying to prevent. "How do you know this?" she asked. "I was in that building until 2 days ago," Morrison replied grimly. "I've been planning this escape ever since I got out. The guards inside are the worst of the bunch. They won't hesitate to follow those orders." This changed everything. Sarah couldn't use the explosive device if it might cause the prisoners to be executed. She needed a more subtle approach that would allow her to neutralize the internal guards before they could carry out their orders. "New plan," Sarah said. "We go quiet. Can you get me into that building without alerting the inside guards?" Morrison nodded. "There's a ventilation system that runs through the roof. It's how I got out 2 nights ago. But it's a tight fit, and you'll be crawling through sheet metal ducts for about 50 yards. "I've done worse," Sarah replied, though privately she wondered if that was true. The ventilation infiltration took nearly 20 minutes. Sarah had to remove her survival vest to fit through the narrow ducts, taking only her pistol and knife. The metal was hot from the day's sun, and sharp edges tore at her flight suit as she crawled toward the main prisoner area. Through ventilation grates, she could see into the barracks. The scene was heartbreaking, men lying on crude bunks, many showing signs of injury and malnutrition, but they were all alive, and she could see the hope in their eyes as they whispered among themselves about the sounds of fighting outside. The 6 guards were positioned throughout the building, each armed with automatic weapons. She counted 2 near the main entrance, 2 in the central area among the prisoners, and 2 more near what appeared to be a smaller holding area for higher value prisoners. Sarah's attack had to be perfectly coordinated. She would need to neutralize all 6 guards simultaneously to prevent any of them from carrying out execution orders. It seemed impossible for one person, but she had learned during her naval career that impossible was just another word for challenging. From her position in the ventilation system, she could see that the guards were nervous, but not yet panicked. The sounds of fighting outside had put them on alert, but they hadn't yet received orders to begin executing prisoners. She had a narrow window of opportunity.
Sarah positioned herself above the central area, where she could drop down between the 2 guards stationed among the prisoners. Her plan was to neutralize these 2 first, then rely on the element of surprise and the prisoners' assistance to overcome the remaining 4 guards. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Sarah took a deep breath and dropped through the ventilation grate into the midst of 200 American prisoners of war.
The moment Sarah dropped into the prisoner barracks, chaos erupted. Her landing took the 2 central guards completely by surprise, and her hand-to-hand combat training allowed her to neutralize both men within seconds of hitting the floor. But the sound of the struggle immediately alerted the other 4 guards throughout the building. "Everyone down!" Sarah shouted to the prisoners as gunfire erupted from the guards near the entrance. "Stay low and follow my orders." The prisoners, seasoned military personnel all, immediately understood what was happening and responded with the discipline that had made them valuable targets for capture. Several of the Marines among them immediately moved to secure the weapons from the guards Sarah had neutralized, while others began organizing defensive positions using the bunks and furniture. But Sarah's biggest advantage came from an unexpected source. Among the prisoners was Lieutenant Colonel Patricia "Tank" Rodriguez, a Marine Corps transport pilot with over 3,000 hours in heavy aircraft. Rodriguez had been captured 3 weeks earlier when her C-130 was shot down during a supply run, and she was exactly the expertise Sarah needed. "Navy, what's your plan for getting us out of here?" Rodriguez asked as she took cover behind an overturned table. "There's an An-12 transport on the airfield. Can you fly it?" Rodriguez grinned fiercely. "I can fly anything with wings, but we need to get there first." The firefight inside the barracks lasted only minutes, but it felt like hours. The prisoners, despite weeks or months of captivity and abuse, fought with the effectiveness of trained military personnel.
Several had been special operations soldiers before their capture, and they quickly organized a tactical response that overwhelmed the remaining guards. Sarah found herself in command of 200 highly motivated and extremely angry American servicemen. The challenge now was to move this large group across hostile territory to the airfield without being detected or stopped by enemy reinforcements. "Listen up," Sarah called to the assembled prisoners. "We're going to move in small groups to avoid detection. Colonel Rodriguez and I will secure the aircraft while the rest of you make your way to the airfield in teams of 10. Stay low, stay quiet, and if you encounter resistance, eliminate it quickly and silently." Major Morrison appeared at the barrage entrance, having completed his diversion at the main gate. "The perimeter guards are down, but we've got vehicles approaching from the south, maybe 30 minutes before reinforcements arrive." Sarah felt the weight of command settling on her shoulders. 200 lives now depended on her ability to execute a plan that was audacious even by military standards. But looking at the faces around her, pilots, Marines, Special Forces operators, sailors, she saw the same determination that had driven her to attempt this rescue in the first place. "Move out," she ordered. The journey to the airfield was a testament to military training and cooperation under fire. The prisoners moved like ghosts through the desert night, using every piece of cover and concealment while maintaining perfect noise discipline. Several small groups encountered enemy patrols, but years of combat experience allowed them to neutralize these threats without raising a general alarm. Sarah and Colonel Rodriguez reached the airfield first, along with a team of Marines who would provide security during the aircraft preparation. The An-12 sat on the tarmac like a sleeping giant, its 4 turboprop engines cold and its cargo bay empty. "It's bigger than I expected," Sarah observed as they approached the aircraft. "That's good. We're going to need every cubic foot of cargo space for this many people." The cockpit of the An-12 was a maze of unfamiliar instruments and controls labeled in Cyrillic script. But Rodriguez's transport pilot experience translated well to the Soviet-designed aircraft. While she worked through the startup procedures, Sarah organized the incoming prisoner groups into loading formations. The first group of prisoners reached the airfield 20 minutes after Sarah and Rodriguez had begun the preparations. These were the most seriously wounded men who had been given priority for evacuation. Sarah helped carry several unconscious prisoners into the cargo bay while Rodriguez continued working through her pre-flight checklist. "How long do you need?" Sarah asked as another group of prisoners reached the airfield. "Another 10 minutes for engine start, then we can begin loading. But Sarah, this aircraft isn't designed for passenger service. We're going to pack people in here like cargo, and it's going to be uncomfortable and dangerous." "They've been prisoners for months," Sarah said grimly. "I think they can handle uncomfortable." As if to emphasize her point, the sound of approaching vehicles could be heard in the distance. The enemy reinforcements Morrison had spotted were getting closer, and Sarah could see headlights beginning to appear on the horizon. "We need to move faster," Sarah called to the Marine security team. "Set up a perimeter defense around the aircraft. We're about to have company." The loading process became a race against time. Prisoners arrived in groups and were quickly directed into the cargo base with the wounded given priority, and the most combat-effective personnel kept outside to defend the aircraft until the last possible moment. Rodriguez managed to start the first engine just as the lead enemy vehicles came within rifle range. The sound of the turboprop spinning up was like music to Sarah's ears, the sound of hope and home and the promise that they might actually survive this impossible mission. But their escape was far from guaranteed. Between them and friendly territory lay hundreds of miles of hostile airspace, enemy interceptors, and the constant threat of mechanical failure in an unfamiliar aircraft.
The firefight at the airfield was intense, but brief. The Marine security perimeter held long enough for Rodriguez to start all 4 engines and for the last groups of prisoners to reach the aircraft. Sarah found herself in the unique position of commanding a ground defense while simultaneously coordinating an air evacuation, skills that weren't typically taught together in any military school. "Last group incoming!" Major Morrison shouted over the sound of gunfire and aircraft engines. He was leading the final 10 prisoners toward the An-12, providing covering fire as enemy vehicles attempted to close the distance to the airfield. Sarah made the hardest command decision of her life. "Everyone aboard now! We're leaving!" The final loading was chaotic but effective. 200 prisoners, many of them wounded, were packed into the An-12's cargo bay in conditions that violated every safety regulation ever written. Men sat on the floor, leaned against the walls, and in some cases were stacked on top of each other. There were no seats, no safety belts, and certainly no emergency procedures briefing. Sarah took her position in the co-pilot's seat beside Rodriguez, despite having no experience with transport aircraft. "What do you need me to do?" she asked. "Monitor the engine instruments and pray," Rodriguez replied, as she released the brakes and began taxiing toward the runway. "This aircraft is overloaded by at least 3,000 pounds, and I'm not sure these engines have enough power to get us airborne." Enemy vehicles were now racing parallel to the taxiway, their occupants firing at the aircraft with small arms. The AN-12's aluminum skin wasn't designed to stop bullets, and Sarah could hear rounds impacting the fuselage as they moved toward takeoff position. "Engine 2 is running hot," Sarah reported, reading the unfamiliar gauges as best she could. "It'll have to do," Rodriguez replied grimly. "We only get one shot at this." The takeoff rolls seemed to last forever. The heavily loaded AN-12 accelerated slowly down the runway, while enemy fire continued to rake the aircraft. Rodriguez held the aircraft on the ground until she had every possible knot of airspeed, then pulled back on the controls with all her strength. For a moment, nothing happened. The aircraft continued rolling down the runway, eating up precious asphalt while Rodriguez fought to get the nose up. Then, slowly, grudgingly, the AN-12 began to lift off the ground. "We're airborne," Sarah called out, though their altitude was barely 50 feet and climbing painfully slowly. The celebration was short-lived. As they cleared the end of the runway, Sarah saw something that made her blood freeze. 2 enemy fighter aircraft were taking off from another runway at the same airfield. In the chaos of the ground battle, no one had noticed that the facility was home to more than just transport aircraft. "We've got company," Sarah reported, pointing toward the fighters. "2 MiGs, looks like they're scrambling to intercept us." Rodriguez's knuckles were white on the controls as she coaxed every possible foot of altitude from the overloaded transport. "This aircraft wasn't designed for air-to-air combat," she said through gritted teeth. "Our only chance is to stay low and try to reach friendly territory before they can organize an effective intercept." The AN-12 was now climbing through 500 feet, but the rate of climb was dangerously slow. Behind them, the enemy fighters were gaining altitude rapidly and would soon have both the speed and altitude advantage needed to attack the lumbering transport. Sarah's fighter pilot training kicked in as she studied the tactical situation. The MiGs had superior speed and maneuverability, but they would need to be careful about their attack angles to avoid hitting the ground during low-altitude intercepts. If she and Rodriguez could stay below 1,000 feet and use the terrain for cover, they might be able to make the enemy fighters' advantages less decisive. "Take us down to the deck," Sarah advised. "Use the hills and valleys for cover. Make them work for every shot." Rodriguez nodded and pushed the aircraft into a shallow descent that brought them within 200 feet of the desert floor. At this altitude, the MiGs would only have seconds to line up their attacks before having to pull up to avoid crashing into the ground. The first attack came 15 minutes into their flight. One of the MiGs dove toward the AN-12 from behind and above, its pilot trying to achieve the classic rear quarter attack position that would give him the best shot at the transport's engines. But Rodriguez's transport pilot experience included defensive maneuvering training, and she threw the big aircraft into a turn that seemed impossible for something so large and heavily loaded. The MiG's burst of cannon fire passed harmlessly to our right, and the enemy pilot was forced to pull up sharply to avoid hitting a ridgeline. The maneuver gave them precious seconds, but Sarah knew they couldn't keep dodging attacks indefinitely. "We need to even the odds," Sarah said, studying the AN-12's unfamiliar control panels. "Does this aircraft have any defensive systems?" Rodriguez shook her head. "It's a cargo plane, not a fighter. No weapons, no countermeasures, nothing but altitude and airspeed for defense." That's when Sarah noticed something interesting about the cargo bay layout. The AN-12 had a large rear cargo door that could be opened in flight for paratrooper operations. It wasn't designed as a weapons system, but Sarah's tactical mind began to see possibilities. "How many of those Marines back there have combat experience?" she asked. "Most of them," Rodriguez replied, still concentrating on flying the aircraft mere feet above the desert terrain. "Why?" "Because I think we're about to turn this transport into a gunship." Sarah's plan was unprecedented in military aviation history. Turn a cargo aircraft full of rescued prisoners into an improvised combat platform using nothing but small arms and tactical ingenuity. It was insane, dangerous, and probably suicidal, but it was also their only chance against the enemy fighters. She made her way back into the cargo bay, where 200 prisoners were packed together in conditions that would have been challenging even in peacetime. Despite their ordeal, these men were all seasoned military personnel, and Sarah could see the determination in their eyes as she explained the situation. "We're being pursued by enemy fighters," she announced. "I need volunteers who are willing to engage enemy aircraft with small arms through the rear cargo door." The response was immediate and unanimous. Every man in the cargo bay who was physically capable volunteered for what amounted to a suicide mission. But Sarah selected only the dozen Marines and Army Rangers who had the most combat experience and the steadiest nerves. Major Morrison helped organize the volunteers, while Sarah worked with the aircrew to figure out how to safely open the rear cargo door in flight. The AN-12's design included provisions for this operation, but it had never been attempted under combat conditions with the aircraft flying at maximum capacity. "Opening that door is going to change our flight characteristics," Rodriguez warned over the intercom. "The drag will slow us down and make us even more vulnerable." "We're already vulnerable," Sarah replied. "At least this gives us a chance to shoot back." The door opening procedure was harrowing. The rush of wind into the cargo bay when the rear door lowered created a maelstrom of noise and turbulence that threatened to suck unprepared personnel out of the aircraft. Sarah had the volunteers secured with improvised safety lines made from parachute cord, but the margin for error was practically zero. The second MiG attack came just as they finished opening the cargo door. This time, both enemy fighters coordinated their approach, with one attacking from each side to prevent the transport from maneuvering away from both threats simultaneously. "Here they come," Sarah shouted over the wind noise. "Wait for my command." The Marines positioned at the rear of the aircraft had a perfect view of the approaching fighters. These were men who had been trained to engage targets under impossible conditions, and their months of captivity had only intensified their desire to strike back at their captors. The first MiG came within range at a distance of about 800 yards, well within the effective range of the AK-47s the Marines had acquired during their escape. Sarah waited until the fighter committed to its attack run, then gave the order to fire. 12 automatic weapons opened fire simultaneously at the attacking aircraft. The volume of fire was impressive, but more importantly, it was unexpected. The MiG pilot had been prepared for evasive maneuvering by the transport, not return fire from small arms. Several rounds struck the fighter's fuselage, and while they didn't cause critical damage, they certainly got the pilot's attention. The MiG pulled off its attack run early, its cannon fire passing well behind the AN-12's tail. The second fighter pressed its attack despite seeing what happened to its wingman. This pilot was either braver or more determined, and he held his attack run until he was within 400 yards of the transport. The Marines were ready for him. The concentrated fire from 12 automatic weapons at close range proved devastating to the lightly armored fighter. Sarah could see sparks and debris flying from the MiG's engine as multiple rounds found their mark. The pilot tried to pull up from his attack, but his aircraft was already doomed. The MiG crashed into the desert floor in a ball of flame, its pilot having no time to eject. The remaining fighter immediately broke off its attack and began climbing to a safer altitude, apparently reconsidering the wisdom of attacking a transport that could shoot back. "Outstanding work," Sarah called to the Marines as they secured their weapons and checked their improvised safety lines. "But this isn't over yet. That remaining fighter is probably calling for reinforcements." As if to confirm her fears, Rodriguez's voice came over the intercom from the cockpit. "We've got multiple radar contacts closing on our position from the north. Looks like at least 4 more fighters, probably vectoring to intercept us."
Sarah made her way back to the cockpit where Rodriguez was pushing the N-12 to its maximum speed while staying as low as possible to avoid radar detection. The aircraft was still dangerously overloaded, but their successful defense against the first two fighters had bought them precious time and distance. "How far to friendly territory?" Sarah asked, studying the navigation charts. "About 200 miles, Rodriguez replied. "But we're not going to make it at this altitude and speed before those reinforcements catch us." Sarah studied the tactical situation with the analytical mind that had made her a successful fighter pilot. The enemy had numbers and speed on their side, but the An-12 had proven that it could defend itself under the right circumstances. The question was whether they could survive long enough to reach coalition airspace. "What if we don't try to outrun them?" Sarah suggested. "What if we turn this into a running battle and make them pay for every mile?" Rodriguez looked at her with a mixture of admiration and concern. "You're talking about turning a rescue mission into an air-to-air combat operation using a cargo plane and small arms." "It's worked so far," Sarah pointed out. As the enemy fighters closed the distance, Sarah realized that their improvised tactics might be the only thing standing between 200 American prisoners and certain death or recapture. The next phase of their escape would test every skill they had learned and push the boundaries of what was possible in military aviation.
The running battle that developed over the next hour would become legendary in military aviation circles. 4 enemy fighters against 1 overloaded transport aircraft seemed like impossible odds. But Sarah and her improvised air crew had advantages that the enemy pilots couldn't have anticipated. The first advantage was experience. The prisoners aboard the An-12 weren't just random military personnel. They were some of the most highly trained and experienced warfighters in the American military. Several were special operations soldiers, others were veteran pilots, and all of them had been selected for their original missions precisely because of their exceptional skills and training. The second advantage was motivation. These men had been prisoners for weeks or months, subjected to interrogation, abuse, and the constant fear of execution. Now they had a chance not only to escape, but to strike back at their captors. Their fighting spirit was something that couldn't be quantified in any tactical manual. The third advantage was Sarah herself. Her fighter pilot background gave her an understanding of air-to-air combat tactics that allowed her to predict enemy attacks and coordinate defensive responses. Combined with Rodriguez's transport pilot experience, they formed an unlikely but effective command team. The enemy's first coordinated attack came at them from multiple directions simultaneously, a classic fighter sweep designed to overwhelm the transport's limited defensive capabilities. 2 fighters attacked from the rear, while 2 more came in from the sides, trying to catch the An-12 in a crossfire that would be impossible to evade. Sarah's response was to do something that had never been attempted in aviation history. She organized a 360-degree defensive fire pattern using prisoners positioned throughout the aircraft. Marines at the rear cargo door engaged the fighters coming from behind, while other prisoners fired through side windows at the aircraft attacking from the flanks. The volume of fire was unprecedented. 40 automatic weapons firing simultaneously created a defensive barrier that the enemy fighters had to penetrate to press their attacks. While individual small arms couldn't reliably destroy a fighter aircraft, the cumulative effect of hundreds of rounds filling the air around their target made accurate gunnery nearly impossible for the attackers. The first enemy fighter to press its attack, despite the defensive fire, paid the ultimate price. A burst from one of the Marines' AK-47s found the aircraft's fuel tank, and the fighter exploded in midair with such violence that debris from the explosion actually struck the An-12's tail section. The remaining 3 fighters pulled back to reassess their tactics. They had expected to be fighting a defenseless transport, not a flying fortress bristling with automatic weapons.
Radio intercepts suggested they were calling for additional support, but also that they were reporting significant casualties from what should have been a routine interception. "We're making them pay," Sarah observed as she coordinated ammunition distribution among the defenders. "But we can't keep this up indefinitely. We're burning through ammo fast, and sooner or later, they're gonna get lucky." Rodriguez had been monitoring their navigation during the fighting, and she had encouraging news. "We're less than 100 miles from friendly territory," she reported. "If we can hold them off for another 30 minutes, we'll be in range of coalition air cover." As if summoned by her words, Sarah's survival radio crackled to life with an American voice. "Unknown transport aircraft, this is Hawkeye 77. We're tracking multiple hostile aircraft in your vicinity. State your identity and intentions." Sarah grabbed the radio with relief that bordered on euphoria. "Hawkeye 77, this is Lieutenant Commander Sarah Mitchell, U.S. Navy. We are a rescued prisoner transport with 200 POWs aboard, requesting immediate air support." There was a long pause before the AWACS controller responded. "Say again, unknown transport, did you say 200 prisoners of war?" "Affirmative, Hawkeye. We have liberated 200 American and Allied prisoners from an enemy facility and are currently under attack by enemy fighters. We need help now." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within minutes, Sarah could see contrails high above as coalition fighters raced toward their position. The cavalry was coming, but the question was whether they could arrive before the enemy fighters made one final, decisive attack. The 3 remaining enemy aircraft seemed to sense that time was running out. They formed up for what was clearly intended to be a final, coordinated assault on the AN-12. This time, they weren't going to be deterred by defensive fire. They were coming in close and fast, accepting casualties to ensure the destruction of the transport and its precious cargo. "This is it," Sarah announced to the defenders throughout the aircraft. "Everything we've got. Make every shot count." The final attack was the most intense combat that any of them had ever experienced. 3 fighters attacking simultaneously from different angles while an overloaded transport aircraft twisted and turned mere feet above the desert floor, its cargo bay full of men firing automatic weapons at supersonic jets. It was a scene that belonged in a movie rather than real life. But reality was often stranger than fiction, and what happened next would be talked about in military circles for decades to come. One of the attacking fighters, pressing its attack despite heavy defensive fire, flew directly into the stream of bullets being put out by the Marines at the rear cargo door. The aircraft's engine ingested debris and rounds, causing a catastrophic failure that sent the fighter cartwheeling into the desert. At the same moment, coalition fighters arrived on scene and immediately engaged the remaining enemy aircraft. The professional fighter pilots, flying aircraft designed for air-to-air combat, made quick work of enemies who had already been damaged and demoralized by their encounters with the AN-12's improvised defensive systems. "This is Viper Flight," came the voice over Sarah's radio. "All hostile aircraft destroyed. Transport, you are cleared to proceed to base. We'll provide escort."
The landing at the Coalition Air Base was unlike anything Sarah had ever experienced. As the AN-12 touched down on the runway, she could see that what seemed like half the base personnel had turned out to witness their arrival. Word had already spread about the impossible rescue mission, and everyone wanted to see the aircraft that had somehow liberated 200 prisoners of war and fought its way back through enemy airspace. Rodriguez brought the heavy transport to a stop with her characteristic skill, though Sarah could see that the aircraft had taken significant battle damage during their running fight with enemy fighters. Bullet holes dotted the fuselage, and one of the engines was trailing smoke, but they had made it home. The moment the engine shut down, medical personnel rushed to the aircraft to begin treating the wounded prisoners. Many of the men required immediate medical attention after months of captivity, but they insisted on walking off the aircraft under their own power whenever possible. These were proud warriors who had endured the unthinkable, and they weren't about to be carried to freedom.
Sarah stood at the rear cargo door and watched as man after man emerged from the aircraft into the bright desert sunlight. She had memorized the faces during their flight, learning names and stories, understanding that each of these individuals represented families who would soon learn that their loved ones were coming home. Colonel Davidson, one of the first prisoners Sarah had freed from the interrogation facility, approached her as the medical teams worked on the other survivors. "Commander," he said, his voice still hoarse from his ordeal but steady with military bearing. "What you did back there, I've been in the military for 22 years and I've never seen anything like it." "We all did it together, Colonel," Sarah replied. "Every man on that aircraft earned their freedom." "Maybe," Davidson said, "but only one of us was crazy enough to think we could steal an enemy aircraft and fight our way home with nothing but rifles and determination." As the last of the prisoners was helped from the aircraft, Sarah finally allowed herself to feel the exhaustion that she had been holding at bay for the past 18 hours. She had been shot down, conducted a solo reconnaissance mission behind enemy lines, infiltrated a heavily guarded POW facility, coordinated a mass escape, stolen an enemy aircraft, and fought an air-to-air battle using improvised tactics that had never been attempted before. Major Morrison, the Air Force pilot who had been planning his own escape when Sarah arrived, found her sitting on the aircraft's cargo ramp as the sun set over the desert. "So, what happens now? Back to flying routine missions?" Sarah looked at the AN-12, its battle-scarred exterior telling the story of their incredible journey. "I don't think anything will ever be routine after this." The debriefing process took 3 days. Intelligence officers wanted to know everything about the enemy facility, the rescue operation, and the improvised air combat tactics that had allowed them to fight their way home. Sarah found herself drawing diagrams, writing reports, and explaining decisions that had been made in split seconds under impossible pressure. But the most important part of the debriefing wasn't about tactics or intelligence. It was about the 200 men who were now safe and would soon be reunited with their families. Each of them had a story of capture, imprisonment, and rescue that would become part of their personal legend for the rest of their lives. Lieutenant Colonel Rodriguez, the Marine transport pilot, whose expertise had made the escape possible, was awarded the Navy Cross for her role in the mission. Major Morrison received the Distinguished Service Cross for his part in the prison break and subsequent defense of the aircraft. But it was Sarah who became the face of the mission in the media coverage that followed. The story of a Navy pilot who refused to abandon her fellow servicemen, who single-handedly planned and executed the most audacious prison break in modern military history, captured the imagination of people around the world. The Navy wasn't quite sure what to do with Sarah after the rescue mission. Her actions had saved 200 lives and provided valuable intelligence about enemy operations, but they had also involved stealing an enemy aircraft, conducting unauthorized combat operations, and basically ignoring every rule in the military handbook. In the end, they decided that heroes who brought everyone home safely deserved recognition, not court-martial. Sarah was awarded the Medal of Honor in a ceremony at the White House, becoming one of only a handful of women to receive the nation's highest military decoration. But for Sarah, the real reward wasn't medals or recognition. It was the letters she received from the families of the men she had helped rescue. Wives, children, parents, and siblings who had thought their loved ones were lost forever now had them home safe because one Navy pilot had refused to give up. Years later, when asked about the mission during interviews, Sarah always insisted that she wasn't the hero of the story. The real heroes, she said, were the 200 men who had endured months of captivity and then found the strength to fight their way home when the opportunity arose. But everyone who knew the story understood the truth. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Phoenix Mitchell had lived up to her call sign that night over enemy territory. Like the mythical bird, she had risen from the ashes of her own destruction to bring new life to others. She had proven that sometimes, when everything seems impossible, the most important thing is to refuse to accept that impossibility as final. The AN-12 they had stolen was eventually returned to flying condition and put on display at the Naval Aviation Museum, where it stands today as a testament to what can be accomplished when courage, skill, and determination combine in defense of fellow warriors. The placard next to the aircraft tells the story of the greatest rescue mission in naval aviation history, but it can barely capture the full scope of what happened during those 18 hours when one woman refused to leave anyone behind.
5 years after the rescue mission, Sarah found herself back in Montana, standing in the same field where she had first dreamed of flying as a child. She had retired from active duty with the rank of commander, her career having reached heights that few naval aviators ever achieved.
But success, she had learned, was measured differently when you had seen what she had seen and done what she had done. The annual reunion of the Phoenix 200, as the rescued prisoners had come to be known, was being held that weekend at a hotel in Denver. Sarah had attended every reunion since the rescue, and each year she was amazed by the resilience and achievements of the men she had helped bring home. They had returned to their families, rebuilt their lives, and many had gone on to distinguished military and civilian careers. Colonel Davidson, now a retired general, had become a successful defense contractor and motivational speaker. His presentations about leadership under extreme circumstances drew from the lessons learned during their captivity and rescue, and he never failed to credit Sarah's courage for making their survival possible. Lieutenant Colonel Rodriguez had returned to flying and eventually commanded her own air transport wing. She kept a photo of the battle-damaged AN-12 on her office wall, and whenever young pilots asked her about the most challenging mission she had ever flown, she would smile and tell them about the night she helped steal an enemy aircraft and turn it into a gunship. Major Morrison had transitioned to commercial aviation after his military service, becoming a captain with a major airline. He often told his co-pilots about the Navy pilot who had dropped out of the sky to save 200 prisoners, and how that experience had taught him that courage wasn't the absence of fear, it was acting in spite of fear when others were counting on you. But the story that meant the most to Sarah came from Petty Officer James Woody Woodson, a Navy helicopter mechanic who had been captured when his unit was overrun during a rescue mission. Woody had been one of the wounded prisoners in the interrogation facility, barely conscious when Sarah first found him. After his recovery, Woody had returned to his home in rural Alabama, married his high school sweetheart, and started a family. He sent Sarah photos every Christmas, pictures of his children learning to walk, graduating from school, playing sports. In every letter, he reminded her that none of it would have been possible without her refusal to leave anyone behind. "My kids call you Aunt Sarah," he had written in his most recent letter. They know the story, of course, how a brave Navy pilot saved their daddy and brought him home. But what they really understand is that sometimes when things seem impossible, there are people who don't give up. You taught them that heroes are real. Standing in that Montana field, looking up at the sky that had shaped her life, Sarah reflected on the paths that had led her to that moment over enemy territory when everything changed. Her father, who had initially opposed her military ambitions, had become her proudest supporter after the rescue mission. He kept newspaper clippings about the story in his wallet and never missed an opportunity to tell anyone who would listen about his daughter, the hero. "You did something that mattered," he had told her during one of their last conversations before his death the previous year. "You brought those boys home to their families. There's no higher calling than that." Sarah had learned that heroism wasn't about seeking glory or recognition. It was about making the right choice in the moment when it mattered most, even when that choice seemed impossible or suicidal. It was about refusing to accept that some situations were hopeless and having the courage to act when actions seemed futile. The Medal of Honor she had received sat in a place of honor in her childhood home, but it wasn't the medal that defined her legacy. Her legacy lived in the lives of 200 men who had come home to their families, in the children who had grown up with fathers they might otherwise never have known, in the ripple effect of lives touched by the simple refusal to give up when giving up would have been easier. Sarah's story had been told in books, documentaries, and countless military training sessions. Young pilots learned about her mission as an example of innovative thinking under pressure. Special operations forces studied her infiltration and assault tactics. Transport pilots examined her improvised defensive strategies. But the lesson that resonated most broadly was the simplest one. When your fellow warriors are counting on you, you find a way. The sky above Montana was clear and blue, the same color it had been on that morning when she first took off on what was supposed to be a routine reconnaissance mission. Sarah could see commercial aircraft passing overhead, their contrails marking paths across the heavens where she had once flown fighter jets. The world of military aviation continued to evolve, with new technologies and new challenges, but the fundamental principles remained the same. Courage, skill, and an unwavering commitment to bringing everyone home. As she prepared to drive to Denver for the reunion, Sarah thought about the speech she would give to the Phoenix 200 and their families. Every year they asked her to speak about the mission, about what it meant, about the lessons learned during those 18 hours that had changed all their lives. This year, she had decided to focus on something different. Instead of talking about tactics or strategy, she wanted to talk about the moment of decision, that instant when she had looked at the enemy compound and chose to turn toward danger rather than safety. It was a choice that each person would face in some form during their lives, though perhaps not as dramatically as she had faced it over enemy territory. The choice to help rather than walk away. The choice to stand up rather than stay silent. The choice to act rather than hope someone else would take responsibility. These were the moments that defined character and created the possibility for extraordinary outcomes from ordinary people. As Sarah drove toward Denver and her annual reunion with the Phoenix 200, she smiled at the thought of seeing all those faces again, men who had refused to give up hope during their darkest hours, who had found the strength to fight when escape seemed impossible, and who had trusted a crazy Navy pilot with a plan that shouldn't have worked but somehow did. Tomorrow, she would return to Montana and to the civilian life she had built after her military service. She worked as a consultant for aircraft manufacturers, taught occasionally at the Air Force Academy, and mentored young women who wanted to pursue careers in military aviation. It was a good life, meaningful and fulfilling, but it would always be defined by those 18 hours when she had refused to accept that 200 American servicemen were beyond rescue. The reunion would be emotional, as it always was. There would be stories and laughter, tears and toasts, and the quiet satisfaction that came from knowing they had all survived something that should have destroyed them. And Sarah would look around the room at faces that had been etched into her memory during the most intense hours of her life, and she would remember why she had made the choices she made. Because in the end, the only thing that really mattered was bringing everyone home. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.